Hey everyone, and thank you for joining me in today's episode of Caserta's Data Intelligence webinar series. I'm your host, Remy Rosenbaum. And today we're joined by special guest, Caserta's founding president, Joe Caserta, who's going to look into his crystal ball of bits and bytes and share with us his predictions on the data and analytics trends and priorities that will shape business in 2020 and beyond. Joe is an internationally recognized public speaker, entrepreneur, technologist, and he co-authored the best-selling Data Warehouse ETL Toolkit, which has become the industry standard for preparing data and analytics. Joe is recognized as an authority on enterprise data analytics and continues to innovate and expand his role in the industry. Caserta remains at the forefront of the data analytics revolution, devising the most unique and advanced analytics environment in use today. Just a little bit of housekeeping and we'll get started. Our complimentary Data Analytics Expert webinar series is designed to give you insight into today's hottest technological trends and issues. And after today's webinar, I encourage you to speak with us about any questions on how to apply what you've learned today at your organization. Of course, our initial consultations are always free, and if we find an opportunity to work together, then we'll discuss the next steps. And if not, we'll be more than glad to point you in the right direction. After the webinar, I'll send you a recording to the email address you provided. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, I encourage you to enter them in the questions panel on the right, and I'll get to them in the live Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Joe, it's all yours.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I am showing my screen. Remy, can you see me?
Yep. Go into full screen mode.
Trying. How's that? Good?
There you go. Thank you.
All right, great. So I'm going to talk about 10 predictions, and I do this annually. So far, so good over the past 5 years or so. What I say generally happens. One of the predictions I made maybe 5 years ago was that the world would be using Hadoop by 2020, and then everyone transitioned to it, but then the cloud became more accessible and Hadoop became irrelevant. So you got me on that one. But besides that, generally, just to set expectations, I'm going to say some things that are going to be pretty provocative, maybe unimaginable, but when you're in data all day, every day, like we are, one of the things that we tend to do is think, no matter how advanced our solutions are, there always has to be a better way. And so we're always thinking about better ways of doing things, and our pulse is always on the pulse of trying to figure out what that better way might look like. So I'm going to come up with 10 things over the next hour, probably won't be a full hour, of what I think is going to happen in 2020 and beyond. 2020 is a year. And some of the things I'm going to talk about will probably take more than a year to fully mature. But I do think that everything I talk about in the next hour, we will start seeing some change in the direction towards each one of these points. So I will talk a little bit about just where we are, and and I don't know if my brain stopped spinning for you. It just stopped spinning for me. There it goes. But I do think that it is probably the most exciting time to be in this world, right? But especially in the world of data, and I think in the world of business, because we are at a pivotal point in the evolution of how we use data. I came up with this what we're looking at here, this revolving brain, is actually from a company called Spark Neuro. And Spark Neuro, what they do is they actually capture the brain waves of people as they're watching movies and watching commercials. And they can actually tell you through monitoring your subconscious activity in your brain whether you find a movie interesting and how it's affecting your emotions. And this is just an example of many examples of how You know, the thing that's really interesting about what we're doing now is not so much that we're creating data. You know, there's a guy named Chris Dancy, who's known as the human cyborg, who says all of this data always existed. Like, we always knew, you know, what our temperature was and, you know, what our sugar level is. But the thing that's different now is that now we have ways of harnessing and capturing this data. And now that we can harness and capture it, it's our responsibility as data experts to be able to analyze it and do something with it. And that's what we're going to talk about, and how to do that, and how to do it in a timely way, how to do it in an efficient way, and how to do it in a way where it's actually going to affect lives, affect revenue, and affect our day-to-day business and and change, going from being a conventional wisdom driven company to being an analytics driven company. And the reason why this is so important, and the way we interact with data, is because, you know, the world is changing. You know, over the next couple of years, we're going to go from being mostly a baby boomer driven culture in the corporate world to being a millennial driven culture in the business world. And, you know, baby boomers, I consider myself almost a baby boomer, and a millennial, we just think differently. And one of the reasons why we think so differently is, if you think of a baby boomer, when it first started interacting with computers and with data, first of all, they didn't have it most of their informative years. And then when they did start experiencing it, it was through their work. So at work, the computers were much more advanced than what they could ever have at home. And then that evolved over the years, but that's really the way they evolved into experiencing with data. When you talk about millennials, millennials were basically born, right? You know, probably by the time they're 10 years old, they had a cell phone in their hand, and they were experiencing data during their formative years. And they were able to get instantaneous responses on anything that they wanted. If they wanted to go see a movie, if they wanted to information on a celebrity, anything that they wanted, instantaneous response. Talk to a friend, instantaneous response. And then they go to work and they want information about their business, and it's an IT project, and they have to wait weeks or months and sometimes years, and it's just completely unacceptable. And, you know, right now it's becoming frustrating for millennials, and it's not that terrible because the millennials are still fairly on the young side. But over the next couple of years, millennials will make up 75% of the workforce, and millennials will be running the business. They will be the CEOs, and many are now, right? CEOs, CFOs, CIOs. So the way we interact with our data has to change. When, you know, over 9 out of 10 people are running their business on their phone, we can't expect someone to have a laptop and write their own report after somebody else gets the data for them. Like that, just that world has to not exist any longer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think we're going to get there. So, you know, so Caserta started as a data warehousing company, and, you know, we progressed through becoming a modern data engineering company. But at the end of the day, we're still collecting requirements. We're still writing data pipelines. We're still creating databases. We're still using BI tools. And the latency for getting new data into the hands of a user still takes too long. Even with the cloud, even with data lakes, even with, you know, the most sophisticated tools out there today, it just takes too long. It's way better than it was, you know, 10 years ago, but it's still not milliseconds, which is where we need to be. You know, if you think about, if you were to search something, or if you were to launch a website, that website, Google would know about that website almost immediately. And if someone was to search that website name, it would find it immediately. It would have all of the metadata associated to it, and it would have the content about it immediately. And that's where we need to get to. Like, if we could do that with the general public, we should be able to do that with our own internal data, and we need to get there, and that should be the goal. So I believe that, you know, the process of understanding what you want before you want it needs to change. Creating normalized data models for everything, every piece of data that you want to analyze has to change. Going through long series of analysis to figure out what's the best system to get something, that also needs to change. Manually writing ETL programs has to change. Rinse and repeating data pipelines to go from one point of repository to another repository to another repository also needs to change. And then asking a business user to create their own reports. That, you know, I think that we will see a time in our career where we can just throw all our reports away, and if we want to know an answer to a business question, we pick up our phone and we ask the question, and artificial intelligence and a chatbot will answer that question. And when you can do that, having reports becomes obsolete. And you know, and I lived in a day where at the end of every month, we would run lots and lots and lots of paper reports and distribute them. And the thought of not doing that anymore was insane, right? Everybody needs their reports. But you know, nowadays, we don't print reports anymore. Now they're online, and if you want to go see it, you get it. Otherwise, it doesn't get distributed to you. And I think we just need to take that to the next level, where we don't need to have every metric on a report. Usually when you hand someone a report, they know exactly where on that page the answer to their question is. So instead of creating all the noise around the answer, just give them the answer. So, you know, there will be a day, and it's, you know, in some cases in its fundamental state, it exists today. But I do think that we should be at a point where any business question should be answered by picking up a phone and saying, hey, what were my sales yesterday? What was my conversion rate for this product last month? We should be able to ask those questions and get those answers immediately in milliseconds. And if we can do that, what do we need reports for? So that's just something to think about. So I do believe that all of the processes that we're doing today, where we're manually building data pipelines, we're going and finding data, doing data analysis, doing source system analysis, data profiling, I think all of that should be replaced with data spiders. Just like Google does with the internet. They go out and they have crawlers and they find out where the new websites are and new information within those websites, and then they capture the metadata and then they have it. I do think that that is the future for enterprise data. I also think that building the pipelines and building the APIs to be able to get at that data should also be automated. And I do think that we will have bots that can do that. We're going to talk about each one of these and what I think some of the existing technologies are and maybe some of the future technologies. And I also think the days of manually creating reports in order to get information will be behind us, and we will start seeing much more natural language processing to interact with your data starting immediately. You know, we'll talk about some of the new innovations that are on the horizon right now. So let's start with the first one. So prediction number one. Prediction number one is data spiders will come to fruition in a very, very significant way. So we will be able to have technology that sits in your corporate environment, whether it's on the cloud or on-prem, it doesn't matter. And it will be able to scour your entire environment and find all of your databases, all of your data sets, reverse engineer the schemas, and be able to find all of the information that you have in your enterprise. This is already happening. There is a company out there called Modak Analytics. I think technically they're a consulting firm that competes with Caserta, or at least they were, but it doesn't matter because what they're doing is really cool, really smart. They've created some great product. They did an implementation for GlaxoSmithKline that does this, and they also have a thing that they call Kosh repository that's open source, so you can go Google it and find it. And this is a repository that helps the automation of things like, getting into, not only finding your database, but all of the privileges to get into your databases so that you can find all of the data within it, fully automated. And I do think that, companies like Tamr and Global IDs, any of the data catalog companies, Waterline, Elation, I think they're probably on the best positions to go into this market, whether they are or aren't. Do some research and find it. But I think that's probably where you're going to find it. All the data catalog companies will start creating data spiders in order to stay relevant. Next one will be the bots. So I do think that once the data is found, it's, we're not splitting atoms here, right? We have data schemas in our source. We want to be able to look at that data and figure out how to correlate across the different data sources to come up with some business answers. So what do? We manually look at the schema, we look at the column names, we look at the data itself, and we make some decisions, right? And we do this manually. And what we do is we look for patterns. You hire, guys like Caserta or anybody other consulting firm or internal knowledge. And what they do is they take their past experience and they say, oh, okay, it looks like these two would probably be joined together. Or, those might be joined together. I think that, we're fairly smart, but I think it's something that a machine can absolutely 100% learn. And I think once you train a machine to understand what joins look like, bringing in new data sets and having machine infer those joins is not out of the realm of possibility. And I think once you have those joins, building pipelines, building the code, right? Having code that writes code is not a new concept, but we'll have code that writes code to automatically build pipelines, transform the data. And then if we need to put it into a new repository, it will. Otherwise, it can build an API so you can access the data wherever it happens to be. I do think, also I think Tamr is doing some of this. There are new startups. Again, research can find it for you. But any ETL product today worth its salt should be looking into doing this type of work. And there's a lot of a grassroots movement within today's corporate environment where they're building bespoke solutions themselves, because there's just too much data. Like, we have clients where they have 7,000 data sources. If you have 7,000 data sources, you cannot possibly build a pipeline one at a time in order to bring all that data in. We need to get smarter about how we do things. And this will happen, and I think it'll happen in 2020. Okay, artificial intelligence for unified data. So now we have all of our source data identified from our crawler. We have all of our pipelines built for ingestion. But now what we need to do is we need to figure out, okay, if we have customers from one system and customers from another system, and they're not exactly aligned, how do we align them? Again, what we do today is we look for common attributes. We look for some kind of mapping. We look for ways to figure out, is the data good? Can it be unified? And if it can, how do we do that? I do believe that with the maturity of artificial intelligence today, we should not be doing this manually anymore. There are ways for machines to learn what data ought to look like. And Tamer, I mentioned Tamer a few times already, but Tamer does actually do this. Do they do it 100%? No, but I do believe that they are on the right track. And I do believe that they could use some competition, because competition would be great in this, because we need to get to this quickly. This is probably the biggest opportunity for the data world within corporate America to start being able to ask a single question about a customer or about a product, and being able to go against any data point, any data source, and being able to come up with a consolidated, unified answer. And this will happen. This has started to happen already with some of the tools here, but it will mature. And manual data modeling, I think, hopefully will be something that we're reading about in the history books 10 years from now. Okay, so now we have our source, our pipelines, our unified data model. Now we need to have some BI. To ask a business user to go find their own data and build their own reports in 2020 just seems insane to me. I think that we need to be able to have any user ask a question in natural language and get an answer in natural language. If we can do it about, the traffic, at home before we leave our office or before we leave our house, we should be able to do it about our key performance indicators within our business. And I think it's insane that we can't. I have a few examples here. If you've never experienced Wolfram Alpha, it's a great product. It's out there on the market. You could just Google it. You could ask it any question, and it'll give you graphical answers in milliseconds. Answer Rocket is another tool that's doing this very, very similar things. Arcadia Data was a product that just recently got acquired by Cloudera, and Microsoft Q&A is attempting to do this, and Tableau just released Ask Data, which is also NLP for your data. I think this will make reporting as we know it today obsolete. And this is probably the most achievable right now, but this will mature over time within the next 2-3 years, to the point where we're no longer even looking at screens. We're just using chatbots in order to get the information we want. Okay, next. I think in order to do all of these things, in 2020, the last few years, technologies have evolved a lot. The way we process our data has evolved a lot. The way we collect our data has evolved a lot. But the way we actually use our data to change the way we do business, I think we're still building reports. And and I think the greatest technology in the world, if we have a build it and they will come mentality, people are just not going to come. And I think that we are seeing at Caserta, the biggest ask of our clients lately has been, okay, we have a great analytics platform now, but we need to help educate the rest of the organization how to become analytics driven. And I think that organizations are starting to have internal and external training and data literacy programs. And I think we're going to see that start to become formalized in a very, very serious way. These solutions are not cheap, and it's a big investment for the enterprise. And unless you couple these investments with a formal data literacy program, adoption is going to be very, very, very difficult. You have to think about what you're asking the average business user to do, right? You're asking the average business user to change the way they think about the way they do business. And it's a very, very big ask to take everything that they've done through conventional wisdom and depend on data analytics to drive their business, right? Takes a lot of training. It's change management. It's redundancy in efforts of trying to get people to depend on a system that they really have no control over, right? And so we are starting to see, where the analytics platform is the back end of the business application, and the having people, be okay with that, and having analytics drive the way they make decisions rather than making decisions and using analytics to confirm those decisions, right? We have to take everything the way we're doing it today and turn it on its head. And in order to do that, it takes diligence and very intentional training and education across the entire enterprise, IT, data scientists, of course, but also the average business person, the average executive leader. Any leadership team in any company should go through data literacy programs, and anyone who uses information, right, to make decisions, which should be everyone, needs to go through formal data literacy programs. So we will see consulting firms, new establishments dedicated to offering data literacy programs, and we'll also see HR departments within corporate America start to come up with data literacy programs internally. So IT and data science and maybe the chief digital officer for the last couple of years has been all about analytics. But what we're seeing is that it is fairly siloed, it is fairly grassroots, and it is fairly kind of boxed in a small group of users in the enterprise that are sharing their insights, but not necessarily enabling the rest of the company to use analytics to actually drive the business. So what we're seeing is companies want to be able to measure what is the maturity of their analytics platform and their analytics usage, and then be able to come up with a roadmap to make it more mature. And I think having formal analytics maturity models is something that will become very, very established in 2020. It will become mandatory for companies to become analytics driven, right? 100%. Like, there's no company that exists today that if they don't start using analytics to run their business, that they'll still be relevant in a couple of years, right? The change has to happen. So in order for any change to happen, you have to measure where you are today and measure where you want to be and come up with a plan and a strategy and a roadmap on how to get there. The best way to do that is you use the maturity model. So that will have a series of indicators, hundreds of indicators that will measure where you are. Do you have a chief data officer? Do you have prioritization for your analytics projects? Do you have budget for your analytics projects? Do you have a scalable infrastructure? Do you have ephemeral data science laboratories where you can do experimentation on your analytics? Like, all of these questions, hundreds of these questions, will help you assess in a very formal way whether you're ready or you're not ready to be a full-blown analytics-driven company. And you'll be able to do this periodically, maybe quarterly, maybe annually, to see if you're actually improving and come up with a roadmap on how to get from, if on a scale of 1 to 5, if you're coming in as a 2 and your goal is to be a 4, what exactly are the steps you need to get there? And I do think that analytics maturity models are something that will be offered, again, from external firms and also internally. throughout the corporate world. I also think that, in this year in 2019, Caserta hired Doug Laney, formerly of the Gartner Group, who wrote the book Infonomics. And in Infonomics, Doug's claim is that we will stop thinking of data as a backroom activity. Data will become an asset, and like any other asset, we will have to measure its value in a very formal way. And Doug came up with methods on how to do that, and figuring out, what is the actual value of your data, just as if it was a building or just if it was an automobile, to figure out what is its usage, what is its value, what would happen if you didn't have it, what would that cost be, what would happen, I like to say that everyone says that data is the new oil, which is incredibly valuable. But the thing that's really cool about data is that data, if you do it right, data creates more data. And every time you use data to create more data, the data that you're creating is even more valuable, right? If you think of the calculation of revenue and expense, right? Both of those are interesting, but it's not until you have net profit that really tells you something, right? So you have two base elements, you're calculating it, you're creating a new piece of data that has more valuable than the other two had originally. And as data evolves, data will become more and more valuable as we use data science to create more and more insights. And coming up with a mathematical process in order to figure out what is the value of your data is something that will be matured in 2020 and embraced by corporate America in 2020. Okay, we've had chief data officers, we have chief digital officers, and there seems to be a misalignment. Chief digital officers tend to need to be thinking purely about the customer. What is the customer thinking? Be the customer advocate and try to evolve the company as quickly as possible to satisfy the customer's needs. The chief data officer says, okay, here's all of our data assets. How do I keep those data assets safe? How do I govern those data assets? How do I disseminate those data assets? And they both have, chief digital officer and chief data officer, they have the same overall goal of using information to drive the business. But I think their day-to-day objectives tend to be misaligned. And I think that we will see a convergence of the two different officers of the organization. Either hierarchically, they will start working together where we have chief data officers reporting to chief digital officers or vice versa, but they will definitely become more collaborative and become better peers because without data, there's no digital. And with no digital, there's no data. And we need to really come to terms with, we need both to work collectively, cohesively, in order to really advance our businesses. Number 9, the fear of the cloud will diminish. Just 3 years ago, there was much resistance about moving to the cloud for security purposes, data sensitivity purposes, for fear of the unknown purposes. But in 2019, and 2018, we've seen a tremendous amount of growth, a tremendous amount of embrace by the enterprise to start moving to the cloud. And I do think that the resistance of the cloud and keeping your data on-prem is really going to be a thing of the past. I do think that the economics of it, of moving to the cloud, and when we are talking about when our number one KPI is speed to value, to get the information of our business into the hands of our users, whether they're customers or employees. When speed is king, we can't beat the cloud. Be able to spin up an environment, get data using all of the techniques and technologies that we've talked about 1 through 8. The only way to make any of this come to fruition is by using the cloud. And I've personally seen in our business and throughout the industry research is that that companies who are on-prem are starting to abandon their old thinking and start moving to the cloud. And then finally, I do think that the leaders in innovation around data has primarily been in financial services, media, entertainment, but I do believe that the year of 2020 will be the year for healthcare. We are seeing a tremendous amount of growth in data innovation or innovation using data in the healthcare world, especially in the research area where we're trying to figure out how to really personalize the experience of a patient with better treatments according to their specific DNA sequence. Right, we're using molecular data with different treatments, with different outcomes, and figuring out what is the best way to treat based on analytics, right? Not based on a conventional wisdom of individual doctors' experiences. And I do think that in 2020, if we were to have a graph of the growth of embrace for analytics, we will see healthcare is going to be at the top of the chart. We recently at Caserta, we just wrote a white paper specifically talking about how we see analytics driving the healthcare industry. And you can pick it up, you can see it here. It's bit.ly URL, healthcare data driven. And those are my 10 predictions for 2020. I do think that we are in a state of evolution. I do think that data is not a fad. I do believe that data is just becoming more and more prevalent in our world, in our life, and the more data that we capture, the more data we'll analyze, and the more we'll use it to make our lives more efficient. And it's not going to slow down. It's not going to stop. Shameless plug. So Caserta is a consulting firm that does strategic advisory services, business transformation consulting, cloud data strategy, advanced technical solutions, data engineering, data management, and data science, ML, and AI. And that's all I've got. Remy, back to you.
Thank you, Joe. That was excellent. I enjoyed a lot of the points you brought up. We're now going to open the floor to questions. You should see in the right panel, there is a questions box, and you can enter your question and Joe will answer it. Let's get started. So Joe, we have a couple questions. So the first is about data spiders. How do I get started with data spiders, and does Caserta implement these?
We do implement them. Truth be told, we do not have any in production at the moment, but we do have, I will share that Caserta has its own innovation lab, and we have built data spiders in our innovation lab. We have a project internally codenamed Peregrine, which is the fastest fowl, I guess, on the planet. And when you want to be the fastest anything, we thought it was kind of an appropriate name. So, we want to come up with a solution that is the fastest at getting access to data. So we are building it internally. Again, you could look at Modak Analytics. You could find them. They created the Kosh repository, which is open source, and you could do research on them as well.
Excellent. Our next question is about pricing. Is there a chance for small and medium businesses to take advantage of the coming technologies and developments you discussed that seem to be prohibitively expensive? Are companies thinking about developing systems and tools for all pockets?
Yeah, so this comes to the build versus buy decision that generally needs to be made. I think that some of the things that I talked about is still in its infancy, and the bigger companies are building them themselves. I think if you're a smaller company, you're probably more positioned to be in a wait and see scenario. I will say that you don't need for everything to be fully baked to get started, though. I think if you're a small business, getting, maybe having the data spider is not as important as having NLP access to your data. So if you're a small business, you may want to look at Tableau Ask Data. That would be a very easy entry point to getting easy access to your data. When you're a very large company and you have hundreds and hundreds of variety of data sets coming in that are always changing, then using the data spider would be more important. But for small businesses trying to get going, some of the vendors out there today are already offering some of these solutions that are fairly, they're within reasonable budgets.
All right, thank you. We have another question. Joe, can you please double click on manual data modeling will not be relevant anymore? I guess, so can you extrapolate on that?
Yeah, I do think that, this is not new either, right? I don't know, there was a product back in the 90s called Kaleido, and Kaleido would attempt at taking business rules and forward engineering those business rules into a data model. And it would also build the pipelines to load those models. It wasn't great. They didn't really survive. I don't think. I hope if they did, congratulations, but I don't think they still exist. But I think the thought of being able to take a bunch of disparate data sources, finding commonality in those data sources, and coming up with a unified model to represent them, I think should not be a stretch of the imagination. And I do think that it should be, we should be able to do that systematically. We should not need to, because if you think about it, what are we doing? If we think about how do we do it today, we have a human being taking a look at all the sources, we're finding all of the attributes, then we're going to the business and we're saying, hey, which of these are meaningful to you? And then we're coming up with data models. When you have, and this is going to sound provocative, but if you have the way we do things today, because it's so labor intensive, every attribute counts. Every attribute has a $ associated to it. So, so we spend a lot of time figuring out what not to bring into our data platform. When you have, because what it does is it creates a lot of noise for businesses to be able to navigate their databases. If you have an environment, where you can use natural language processing to answer a question, and you have 10,000 or 100,000 attributes, but you only need 2 of them, you can ask a bot to say, what were my sales yesterday? That bot will know which attributes to go get. Just like if you were to ask Siri the temperature right now, there's probably 10,000 different sources for temperature. It will tell you in a millisecond what the temperature is. Not only that, it knows where you're standing at that moment, and it'll tell you the temperature where you are in that moment, right? In milliseconds. So if we could do that, we should be able to do, to figure out how to build data models, right? Without having, a 3 to 6 month exercise on figuring out, what's the best table structure to represent this business process.
Thank you, Joe. And we have time for just one more question. All other questions we will get back to via email. And the last question is, Joe, is there a key database technology critical to the ability for us to achieve your vision for data, i.e. graph versus NoSQL versus SQL?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think graph is representative of our future. I do think that the idea that everything needs to be in a table with columns and rows, I think is starting to become a thing of the past. As long as we're using SQL as our main interface for getting answers, it just needs to be that way, right? We need to have tables, or at least emulate tables if the source doesn't really look like tables. But I do think that as it becomes less and less important, as SQL becomes less and less important, if you ask Siri what the temperature is, it's not firing off a SQL statement, right? I think as technologies evolve, the technology of the data repository will evolve also. I do think graph is still very relevant and will be in the future. But depending on where in the process, in the pipeline of data we're talking about, if we're still building transactions, if we're still making sales, I still think for data integrity, right now, relational databases are still relevant. Will they be 5 years from now? Maybe not. But I think when we're talking about analytics, the structure of the repository of data becomes less and less important. And I think the reason it becomes less and less important is that I believe, this could be a separate prediction, but I think it's relevant to every prediction, is that every interaction of data in 2020 and beyond will go through APIs. And I think once you have an API layer to get the answers to your data, the structure of that underlying data and the location of that underlying data becomes less important.
All right, Joe, thank you. That was an excellent webinar with lots of great insights. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And the recording of the webinar will be sent out to the email address you provided. Again, Joe, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Remy. Take care.